Welcome to video number 4 about my theory of developmental stuttering. Recall I presented this causal chain for an instance of stuttering. Insufficient attention to the auditory channel when speaking results in poor processing of the auditory feedback of speech. This elicits invalid error signals in the monitoring system which inhibit speech and cause stuttering. This video is about the end of the causal chain, about how invalid error signals cause stuttering. The video has 3 parts. First, we'll look at the problem from a psycholinguistic perspective. I'll argue that the inhibition of speech by an invalid error signal is a normal and automatic brain response. The second part of the video will be about the brain mechanism. And in the third part, we'll look at the 3 types of core symptoms: repetitions, prolongations, and blocks. Now let's get started. In my last video, I said that an invalid error signal automatically triggers an interruption of speech. With this figure, I try to make clear that it isn't a pathological mechanism specific to stuttering, but the normal response to a certain type of speech errors when they are detected. In my last video I also distinguished between physical and linguistic speech errors and explained why I don't think that physical speech errors play any role in the causation of stuttering. So let's look at linguistic errors. They can be further divided into structural and semantic errors. The difference for speech monitoring is that detection of semantic errors depends on understanding word meanings, whereas detecting structural errors only depends on comparing structures or patterns, which takes less time. I assume that poor processing of auditory feedback causes errors that resemble real phonological errors. For example, it may look as if a word is being started, although the word before wasn't finished. And I think that the brain reacts to such a seeming phonological error just as to a real phonological error, namely by interrupting speech. And I assume that the latter is an automatic brain response. Is there any evidence for? In my last video I already mentioned Levelt's main interruption rule. Stop the flow of speech immediately upon detecting trouble. In the study based on which he formulated this rule, participants described patterns consisting of colored dots that were connected by horizontal or vertical arcs. They were asked to describe the patterns so exactly that a listener would be able to draw them from the tape-recorded description. This diagram from Levelt's paper shows the relative frequency of self-interruptions with different delay times given in the number of syllables between error and interruption. And you can see that most interruptions were immediately, with only 1 syllable between error and interruption. Interruption before 0 means that the speaker didn't finish a wrong monosyllabic word, but stopped within the syllable and started a repair. The errors preceding these extremely early interruptions were probably not detected via auditory feedback, and not by feedback monitoring at all, but by conflict monitoring during speech production. In 2011, Nozari, Dell and Schwartz proposed a corresponding model. In 2015, Martin Pfeiffer published results of a study about error repairs in German language in a book. This is the percentage of self-interruptions depending on delay time in syllables. As you can see, the distribution is similar to that in Levelt's study. More than 77% of the interruptions followed immediately after the errors. The data for these 2 diagrams are from table 72 in Pfeiffer's book. On the left you can see the frequency with which different types of speech errors occurred. 386 out of 485 were semantic errors. Merely 58 were phonological and 41 were pragmatic errors. So merely 11.5% of all speech errors in the study were phonological. On the right, the mean delays of interruptions are shown for the different types of errors. And you can see that the delay is by far the shortest after detecting a phonological error. Accordingly, Pfeiffer writes that there is a tendency to initiate phonological repairs particularly quickly, whereas semantic and pragmatic repairs are often delayed. As the data show, phonological errors that require repair are not frequent when speaking in our native language. But the interruption of speech, particularly after detecting such errors, seems to be a fairly automatic brain response. This view is in line with Layer, 1972, who didn't even consider conscious awareness necessary for error detection in speech. He wrote, "It is often the case that a speaker makes a slip and corrects it without either the speaker or the listener being aware that a slip has occurred." However, if such an automatic interruption mechanism exists, is it already present in young children at the age at which stuttering typically onsets? Manfra, Tyler, and Winsler 2016 report that 3- and 4-year-old children repair their speech errors, not only when talking with others, but also when talking to themselves. And interestingly, when talking to themselves, the percentage of immediate repairs was higher than in talking with others. This suggests that we don't repair our slips for others, and again points to an automatic behavior. I think that this automatic interruption mechanism develops as a component of speech monitoring when children start forming sentences, because the function of linguistic speech monitoring is to ensure correct speech and to prevent us from continuing after a speech error. Such an early development of a self-interruption mechanism for speech is not as surprising as it may appear, because it doesn't arise specifically for speaking. Its biological basis is what is called global response inhibition or freezing, a mechanism allowing us to stop any action immediately if necessary. That such a mechanism may underlie stuttering was proposed by Neve et al. 2016-2017, based on functional MRI and diffusion imaging results. In their paper from 2017, they write that stuttering might be caused by an overly active global response suppression mechanism. Similarly, Orpella et al. 2024, who recorded MEG data from stutterers during anticipation of stuttering, concluded that stuttering may be a freezing-like response caused by reactive inhibitory control. Global response inhibition has usually been tested using external cues, but Orpella et al. Write that reactive inhibitory control would immediately follow some kind of internal or external cue associated with halting the currently planned action. Therefore, I think that an innate global inhibition mechanism is involved in stuttering. This mechanism itself works normally, but in stuttering it is triggered by wrong internal cues, by invalid error signals resulting from poor processing of auditory feedback. Let's now look what may happen in the brain. Speech monitoring is localized in the superior temporal cortex. Cheng et al. 2010 investigated which brain regions were more sensitive to speech errors during speech production than during passive listening to speech. Here you can see the fMRI results. Clusters along the superior temporal sulcus and superior temporal gyrus bilaterally. But the cerebellum as well is involved in error detection and correction, generally and in speaking. According to Seidler et al. 2015, the cerebellum is involved in motor sequence learning and error correction based on sensory feedback. Cheng et al. 2013 found the cerebellum to be part of a network that appeared to encode an error signal in response to distorted auditory feedback during speech production. Figure 4 from that study shows this network. Supplementary motor area mainly on the right hemisphere, anterior cingulate cortex, left and right angular gyrus, and the cerebellum, mainly the left hemisphere but also on the right. That's the speech error detection network, and if invalid error signals in the brain cause stuttering, the cerebellum is likely to be involved. Anatomically, there is evidence of an indirect connection between secondary auditory areas and cerebellum. According to Marian and Borgatti 2018, temporal association areas project via the pons to the cerebellum, while feedback from the cerebellum runs via the thalamus. But there is also evidence of a direct bidirectional connection between right posterior superior temporal gyrus and cerebellum, according to Sokolov et al. 2014. Is there any evidence that the cerebellum is involved in stuttering? Yes, there is. In functional neuroimaging studies, the cerebellum was found to be overactive during speech in stutterers compared to controls, and in within-group comparisons, also overactive during stuttered speech as compared with fluent speech of stutterers. Ingham et al. 2003 published a between-group comparison of brain activation during speech in stutterers and normal speakers based on positron emission tomography. This is figure 2 from that paper, showing the number of significantly activated voxels on average for several brain regions in the left and right hemisphere, in adult male stutterers, the yellow bars, and normally fluent controls, the black bars. As you can see, the most striking differences in activation between the groups are in 2 brain regions. First, in secondary auditory areas, namely in superior temporal gyrus and middle temporal gyrus. There is large activation in the controls, but nothing in the stutterers. Remember, in my second video on this channel, I reported on studies showing a strong impact of attention on activity in these brain areas. I think the lack of activity in these areas in stutterers is due to insufficient attention to the auditory channel while speaking. The second noticeable group difference is in the cerebellum. Large overactivations in lobule 6 in the left, but also in the right hemisphere, and in lobule 7. I think that particularly the overactivity in the left cerebellar hemisphere is related to the invalid error signals that trigger stuttering. Right cerebellar overactivation may have more to do with learned strategies to cope with stuttering. Budde, Barron and Fox 2014 investigated in a meta-analysis which brain areas were over or underactivated in stutterers during habitual speech, that is potentially stuttered speech, compared to fluent speech under fluency-enhancing conditions. This is an excerpt from figure 2 from that paper. Below, again, the number of significantly activated voxels on average in the left and right brain hemisphere. Areas of consistent activation during fluent speech are marked blue, and as you can see, all the blue-marked areas are auditory areas in the temporal cortex bilaterally. That is, fluent speech of stutterers is associated with increased activation in auditory brain areas. And let me say it again, activation in auditory brain areas is modulated by attention to the auditory channel. Brain regions consistently activated during habitual, more or less disfluent speech are marked in red, strikingly right frontal premotor areas, and the 4 red-marked areas below belong to the cerebellum. That is, stuttered speech is associated with overactivity in the cerebellum, particularly in the left cerebellar hemisphere. Further evidence for a crucial role of the cerebellum in stuttering comes from Wymbs et al. 2013. They used event-related fMRI to identify individual differences in the brain activations of 4 stutterers during stuttered and fluent speech. They found many brain regions that were overly active during stuttered speech. However, the across-subject agreement was minimal. The only brain region that was overactive during stuttered speech in all the 4 participants was the left cerebellum. See table 4 in that paper. However, all these findings of cerebellar overactivation could also be related to overt stuttering behavior only, but not to the cause. A clear indication that the cerebellum plays a crucial role in causing stuttering comes from reports on cases in which lifelong stuttering permanently disappeared after a damage to the cerebellum. Budde 2011 reported the case of a 54-year-old man who lost his lifelong stuttering after an ischemic infarct on the left side of the brainstem and in both hemispheres of the cerebellum. Two earlier cases were reported by Miller in 1985. Severe stuttering disappeared with progressive multiple sclerosis associated with bilateral cerebellar dysfunction. A further case occurred in Germany in 2012. A 52-year-old woman lost her lifelong stuttering after an injury to the left cerebellar hemisphere during the removal of an acoustic neuroma, a non-cancerous tumor. In 2013, 1 year after the tumor operation, she wrote in the magazine of the German Stuttering Self-Help Association, "When I woke up from the coma, something was changed in my speaking. Something was missing, the stutter. It remained absent when speaking. I write when speaking because it was still present in my thoughts. That is, I was waiting for the stutter at every word, but nothing came. Stuttering was so strongly linked to my emotions that initially it was hard for me to accept the missing stutter." So far the quotation, translated and slightly shortened by me. I spoke with her on the phone in 2015 and 2016, and she was speaking fluently at a normal rate, not slowly. However, the damage to the cerebellum resulted in motor impairments. For example, she needs to use a walker because of problems with balance. Unfortunately, a scientific report on this case hasn't yet been published at November 2025. But there is a video on YouTube with a report by Martin Sommer from the University Göttingen from 2019. The link address is among the references under the video. In all those cases, stuttering totally disappeared only by an impairment of cerebellar function, and this strongly suggests that the cerebellum is the crucial component of the neural network underlying stuttering. But how can the cerebellum trigger stuttering? The place in the brain where ultimately the decisions are made on what we do or don't do is the basal ganglia. They can either initiate or inhibit a planned motor action. And so they have been suspected of being responsible for stuttering by some researchers. However, according to Boston and Strick 2018, basal ganglia and cerebellum together form a network for motor control. Namely, the subthalamic nucleus in the basal ganglia is the source of a projection via the pontine nuclei to the cerebellar cortex. And the dentate nucleus in the cerebellum is the source of a projection via the intrathalamic nuclei to the striatum, the basal ganglia input structure. See also Wang et al. 2020. Cerebellar output preferentially supports the indirect pathway, that is, the inhibitory function of the basal ganglia. So the cerebellum can send an error signal to the basal ganglia and trigger the inhibition of a wrong motor action. The projection from the cerebellum to the basal ganglia runs through the medial thalamus, and here a further case report is interesting by Muroi et al. 1999. A 64-year-old man lost his lifelong severe stuttering after a stroke that affected the medial thalamus bilaterally. This patient lost not only stuttering, the authors write, he was a serious, hard-grained and taciturn person and had had severe stuttering since childhood. When he regained consciousness, his speech appeared fluent and no stuttering was noted. After 3 weeks, he was fully awake and manifesting childish behaviors in his interactions with other people. He sang nursery songs for hours or played choo-choo with his wife. His childish behavior and easygoing manners have persisted and the stuttering has disappeared. I think that error signals from the cerebellum no longer inhibited his behavior, since the thalamic lesion had interrupted the pathway to the striatum. This made his stuttering disappear, but also the ability to become aware of his inappropriate childish behavior. Now let's go back to what may happen in the brain immediately before overt stuttering. When the striatum receives an error signal from the cerebellum, then the striatum inhibits the external part of the globus pallidus, GPE. The GPE in turn has inhibitory projections to the subthalamic nucleus. So the inhibition of the GPE disinhibits, that is, activates the subthalamic nucleus. Now the loop is closed between subthalamic nucleus, STN, and cerebellum. I think the meaning of this loop is that during the execution of a learned motor sequence such as speech, the STN permanently asks the cerebellum if everything is okay. And when the cerebellum detects a mismatch between prediction and feedback, it answers via the striatum. Here's again the loop between STN and cerebellum a little smaller, because I'll need more space to show what happens now. And my drawing, of course, totally ignores the spatial relationships in the brain. When the cerebellum detects an error, the activity in this loop and with that in the STN increases, and the STN, through excitatory projections, activates the internal part of the globus pallidus GPI and the substantia nigra reticulata, the output structures of the basal ganglia, which then inhibit motor thalamus and motor cortex. That's the indirect pathway through the basal ganglia. And that the indirect pathway is involved in stuttering is suggested by the results of Metzger et al. 2018. They observed increased functional coupling between GPE and cortex, suggesting an excessive activity of the indirect pathway and thus an increased inhibitory action on the cortex during stuttering. You may ask, is it likely that the cerebellum so strongly influences the basal ganglia? An example for this is dystonia. Similar to stuttering, dystonia has often been considered a basal ganglia disorder, but there's growing evidence that the cerebellum is involved. See for example Tevari, Freeman and Rodacha 2017. In animal models, dystonic postures were evoked by abnormal cerebellar output and abolished by silencing or lesioning the cerebellum. And as we saw earlier in the case reports, a lesion to the cerebellum can even abolish lifelong stuttering. However, I don't assume that stuttering is a kind of dystonia. Dystonia seems to be caused by a cerebellar dysfunction. In stuttering, by contrast, cerebellum and basal ganglia only do their jobs when they interrupt a motor sequence after a real or apparent error was detected. An error signal from the cerebellum supports the indirect pathway through the basal ganglia, which inhibits speaking. I think that's the original and basic mechanism underlying developmental stuttering. Is there an alternative mechanism without cerebellar involvement? Some authors have pointed out the possibility that the hyperdirect pathway through the basal ganglia plays a role in stuttering. Hyperdirect pathway means that projections from the frontal cortex bypass the striatum and GPE, so I can leave them out here in my drawing, and directly activate the subthalamic nucleus. For example, projections from the right inferior frontal gyrus or the pre-supplementary motor area. Neef et al. 2016 hypothesized that stuttering may be caused by an amplified inhibitory activity of the right IFG-SDN basal ganglia pathway. The right IFG was indeed found to be overactive in stutterers and is essential for voluntary stopping an intended motor action. However, the inhibition of speech and stuttering occurs against the speaker's will. Therefore, I think that the right IFG rather plays a compensatory role in stuttering, as Orpella et al. 2024 have assumed. They used magnetoencephalography to investigate the cortical activity during the anticipation of stuttering and found no increased activity over the right IFG. But they found increased beta power over the right pre-SMA, a brain region also involved in action stopping in response to perceived action errors. In such cases, however, action stopping is still voluntary. You do it actively. Stuttering, by contrast, happens to the person totally against his or her will, like an accident. In their study, Orpella and colleagues presented a word on which stuttering was anticipated, and then a cue appeared 1 second before the go signal for speaking. The cue told the participants that they actually had to speak the word after the go signal. There were also trials without speaking. The authors assumed that the cue would act as an implicit no-go signal because of the stutterer's learned association between stuttering and its negative consequences. I doubt that the cue acted as an implicit no-go signal. The participants certainly knew that their stuttering would have no negative consequences but was desired. I rather think that the participants understood this cue as a signal to make an effort to get the word out after the go signal, despite the anticipation of stuttering. And the increased beta power over the right pre-SMA recorded in the time window between cue and go signal reflected this readiness. This view is in line with Lau et al. 2004, who found that pre-SMA activity was related to attention to the intention to act. More interesting in my view is a possible role of the insula and the amygdala when stuttering occurs after an anticipation of stuttering. Negative emotions and fear are associated with increased activity in these areas. See for example Fitzgerald, Diganji and Pham 2018. The insula was found to be overactive during stuttered speech, as you can see here. This is again figure 2 from Ingham et al. 2003, and you can see a large cluster of activation in the anterior insula bilaterally in the stutterers. The bar for the controls would be here. There's nothing. And this is again from the meta-analysis by Budde, Barron and Fox 2014, again from figure 2 but the between group comparison. Regions with greater activations in stutterers than in normal speakers are shown in red, and regions with greater activations in normal speakers in blue. As you can see, two clusters in the right insula were more active in stutterers, a cluster in the anterior insula, and a large one more posterior. Toyomura et al. 2018 found that the activity in the right amygdala was correlated to the occurrence of stuttering and to the stutterer's discomfort during the speech tasks in the study. These findings suggest that insula and amygdala are involved in stuttering, but how are they connected to the basal ganglia? According to Denny et al. 2014, the insula has reciprocal projections to the amygdala, and the amygdala has projections to the subthalamic nucleus. See also Barbier et al. 2020 for details. And the amygdala has reciprocal projections to the periaqueductal gray, which is crucial for freezing responses in animals. See for example Kim et al. 2013. I think this network could trigger or support a freezing response when a stutter block is anticipated. However, such possibly short-term activations deep in the brain are still difficult to detect. So I think that an inhibition of speech against the speaker's will can be triggered in two ways. First, poor processing of auditory feedback results in an invalid error signal sent from the cerebellum to the striatum, supporting the indirect pathway through the basal ganglia. And second, anticipation of stuttering activates insula and amygdala, and the latter projects to the subthalamic nucleus in a kind of hyperdirect pathway. The latter way is a secondary mechanism which can arise after a stuttering child has developed an awareness of the disorder. And this secondary mechanism could provide one possible explanation for the occurrence of stuttering at the very onset of an utterance, where auditory speech feedback is not yet available. However, the cerebellum could even be involved in triggering these symptoms by inhibiting an action that is likely to fail. The results of Wymbs et al. 2013 and the reports on cases in which stuttering disappeared after an impairment of the cerebellar function suggest that developmental stuttering doesn't work without involvement of the cerebellum. These two ways both activate the subthalamic nucleus, the part of the basal ganglia that is crucial for the indirect pathway which inhibits the motor cortex. But there may be a further way to inhibit speaking. According to Peter Marian, 2018, two networks are involved in speech production. One that includes Broca's area and the SMA, among others, and a phylogenetically ancient motor pathway for vocalization. This includes, among others, the periaqueductal gray, which is essential for freezing, and basal ganglia and pons, and projects to cranial nerve motor nuclei in the lower brainstem, responsible for the innervation of the vocal tract musculature. An involvement of this ancient vocalization network would explain why moments of stuttering are often experienced as a loss of control. I think as long as the cortex or the corticobasal ganglia thalamocortical loop controls our behavior, we feel as people who do or don't do something. But stuttering happens to us, and an involvement of that subcortical vocalization network could account for this feeling of loss of control. Moreover, looking at stuttering symptoms, we find that the inhibition of vocalization is a common feature of the three types of core symptoms: repetitions, prolongations, and blocks. Note the difference between phonation and vocalization. Phonation is only vibration of the vocal cords and even present when producing voiced consonants. Vocalization is forming the different vowel colors or qualities. More than 100 years ago, Blumel, 1913, assumed that in stuttering a consonant is prolonged or repeated because the vowel is delayed, and that this delay reflects a momentary inability to generate the vowel color or vowel quality. Wingate, 1988, found this to be confirmed by the data, and he characterized the stutter event as a difficulty in the transition to the syllable nucleus, the vowel or diphthong. I'll hardly stutter Paul, but Paul, and not Susan, but Susan. That is, after the repeated consonant follows only a so-called neutral vowel or schwa sound, but not the true vowel of the syllable. This suggests that in the core symptoms, except whole word repetitions, the brain inhibits speech in always the same way, by inhibiting vocalization. And this in turn suggests that stuttering is not due to a breakdown of control, but to a controlled and targeted brain response. However, an inhibition of speech is not yet stuttering. What comes in addition is the effort to overcome the inhibition and to continue speaking. This spontaneous reaction to the inhibition is quite natural. Imagine a door that was never locked or jammed, but suddenly you can't open it. What would you do? My first reaction would be I try it with more force. And the stutterer does the same when speech is suddenly blocked for no apparent reason. So I think that stuttering consists of two components: an inhibition of speech controlled by a subcortical network mainly driven by the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, and a spontaneous attempt to continue speaking with more or less effort, mainly driven by the SMA or pre-SMA and the direct pathway through the basal ganglia. Finally, let's look at the core symptoms once again. How do they come about? Assuming they result from an inhibition of vocalization, we can describe them as follows. If the affected word or syllable onsets with a vowel, the inhibition of vocalization results in a silent block. If a prolongable consonant such as F, S, or M precedes the vowel, then the transition to the vowel is blocked. The consonant is either repeated together with the schwa sound, for example, Susan, or prolonged, Susan, depending on the muscular tension. If a stop consonant precedes the vowel, the consonant is also either repeated together with the schwa sound, Paul, or a silent block occurs, Paul, again depending on the muscular tension. Looking at the motor program, we can say that in case of a repetition, the program starts again and again as long as the inhibition of the vowel lasts. In case of a prolongation, the motor program is caught on the consonant preceding the vowel because the transition to the vowel is blocked. And in case of a block, the program can't start because the first sound, the vowel, is inhibited. There is much more to say about the symptoms, but this video is already very long. For whole word repetition, see in my website the chapter 2.5. The link address is also under the video. Let's summarize. Stuttering is not breakdown of motor control, but the brain's response to an invalid error signal that looks like real phonological error. For example, like an incompletely spoken word. In such cases, the brain automatically interrupts speech based on an innate global response inhibition mechanism. Cerebellum and basal ganglia together form a network for motor control, so that the cerebellum can trigger an inhibition of speech when an error is detected. As a secondary mechanism, insula and amygdala may trigger or support an inhibition of speech when stuttering is anticipated. A common feature of the core symptoms is the inhibition of vocalization, and here a phylogenetically ancient pathway to the brainstem could be involved. A moment of stuttering has two components, an inhibition of speech against the speaker's will and the attempt to continue by the speaker's will. All in all, I think that the speech production system works normally in stutterers, even though speaking is not as automatic as in normal speakers, but that's a consequence of stuttering. The cause is poorly processed auditory feedback due to insufficient attention to the auditory channel while speaking. That's all. The aim with this video was to propose a physiologically possible way how invalid error signals may cause stuttering. Much of them, what I've proposed, may appear speculative and difficult to test. But my stuttering theory is testable as a whole. See the first video on this channel. Thank you for your interest and attention. As always, you can find the complete references on my website and the DOIs also under the video. If you have any questions or objections, please leave a comment.